Welcome to On Our Watch, a podcast about coastal erosion and sustainability in Louisiana, as well as the implications for coastal systems worldwide. My name is Marian Evans. I'm a filmmaker and a producer of the documentary On Our Watch, a feature-length film about Louisiana's coastal land loss crisis. The film's director, Jonathan Evans, and I are proud to produce this podcast series that will continue to explore important coastal issues through conversations with local residents, community leaders, and experts. In this episode, we're speaking with Tina Freeman. Tina is a New Orleans-based photographer. Her project, Lamentations, juxtaposes images of the Louisiana wetlands with ice in the Arctic and Antarctic. And now, our interview with Tina Freeman. Well, thank you, Tina, for joining us today. So you've been a working photographer for many years now, and I wanted to ask you about how you originally decided to go into photography as a career. And was this something that you always knew you wanted to do?
Yes, I learned how to use a darkroom when I was 12. And then in high school, I did a lot of photography. The school that I went to had a darkroom. And I have a BFA in photography. I only applied to one place, and unlike the way that a lot of people apply to numerous places these days, got in and did my degree in photography. And then I started working as an assistant pretty much right away. And then I went to be the curator of photography at the New Orleans Museum of Arts in 1978 to 82. And I decided that I really wasn't a curator. Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed putting exhibitions together, but I decided I really wanted to work as a photographer. So I started doing commercial work. And then I worked for magazines, mostly doing interiors and editorial portraiture. So I worked for Connoisseur, Art and Antiques, New York Times Magazine, Elle Decor, Country Life. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so you had a singular focus. You knew this is what you wanted to do.
Yeah.
And as someone who has photographed the Louisiana wetlands quite a bit, how would you describe your personal relationship to that environment in South Louisiana?
Okay, well, we did a lot of fishing when I was growing up. And in the fall, we would go out in the Louisiana marshes, which are the areas that are kind of due south of Mississippi, the Mississippi coast, around the Chandelier Islands, but actually closer in. And that was just amazing. It was the beginning of the cool weather. We would stay overnight on the boat, and it was so magical. The birds, the quiet, the water, the marshes, just in general, it was one of my favorite places to be. And we also, I talk about it in the Lamentations book, we also fished off of the mouth of the Mississippi River. So I was very aware of the marshes around the Range Rear Light Station, which is still there, actually. It's an old lighthouse that, being a range, it allowed people to use it to come into the river. And my favorite things were just to go up at the top of the lighthouse, look at the marshes, just extensive marshes. And then the difference in that, and then later on the marshes kind of becoming rotten and disappearing, and then going down to places like Leeville and seeing how sea level rise has affected those areas. Like last weekend, I was down in Grand Isle and stopped at the Leeville Cemetery again. I've been looking at it since even before Katrina, and as it just goes,
Yeah.
just kind of, it's almost not there now.
It's interesting. So even at a young age, like it made an impact on you, even if you didn't know exactly what you were seeing?
It was just beautiful. I mean, it's an interesting landscape that people are beginning to appreciate now. From, of course, people who live here have always appreciated it, but I think people from outside of Louisiana sometimes maybe appreciate it a little bit more than they did because they know it a little bit more, perhaps.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe not.
And so what was the impetus for you to actually start photographing it in your work? How did that start?
Well, I started doing the Arctic, making the decision to go to Antarctica, and 2011 was huge. It was really a huge decision because it's a big investment to go. Mm-hmm. And there were a group of photographers, 84 photographers, that I had the opportunity to go with. That it was, and I did, and it was life-changing. Mm-hmm. Antarctica was like going to another planet, and it's so beautiful. And I knew that I really wanted to go there because of how otherworldly the landscape was. And I came back with images that I really loved. And then on New Year's Eve, we were invited to a party near Morgan City at a duck camp. And I went out on New Year's Day, and it was a misty day. And I started photographing then, because I'd never really photographed. And that particular place, it's called Avoca, is extraordinary because it has the entire gamut of what the wetlands have. It has trees, it has the marsh, it has the swamp, it has the irises, it has the birds. It was just the ideal place to be able to go. And the first photograph that I took there on that day, I realized that was a pair. That really, the wetlands and the Arctic are so clearly connected. What was going to melt in the Arctic was going to end up in the wetlands.
So right then that's where you came up with the idea for the whole pairing those two together.
And also it helped that my collaborator from the Artist Spaces book really kind of pushed me into it. Mm-hmm. And I sort of resisted it a bit, but he really helped me get started on it. And then I took 7 years, I guess it was, to finish the pairing. The pairing was really not immediate in that, I tried it all sorts of different ways. I tried doing quick pairing, and that didn't work. And then I had a wall in my studio that I can put magnets on, and I just started pairing photographs and making lots of little prints and just putting them together. And so, yeah.
And so why did you decide to call it Lamentations?
Well, that was probably one of the hardest things, was coming up with the right name. Lost was the name that I used at first. But I think Lamentations was more accurate. Mm-hmm.
Just kind of looking at something that's sort of fading away.
Yes. Yes. And it's changing incredibly quickly. And it's also interesting to fly over it now and be down at Grand Isle like I was for the Bird Festival, and seeing the work that they're doing with the riprap to try to keep the island there, and then realizing how incredibly important it is to those migrant birds to have that landing spot.
Yeah. And so you say you took 7 years to complete the project, and obviously taking lots of photos around the wetlands. Did you go back to the Arctic as well?
I did. I went back one more time on a boat where I could photograph again, but I to Antarctica, and then I went to the Arctic. I went to Iceland, I went to Greenland. I became obsessed with the Arctic and ice, and so
Yeah, this is two polar opposite environments.
yeah, the ice and the wetlands, yes,
Right.
yeah.
What kinds of discussions do you think your project Lamentations invites people to have about nature? And was there anything in the response to that project that you didn't expect or intend for?
I was surprised that people were, you know, listening to people comments at the exhibition. I was surprised by the lack of awareness of what's happening with the glaciers. Now in the book we used alpine glaciers. There are no alpine glaciers in the book. Alpine glaciers for the what is disappearing because they're easier to measure. You can measure the face of an alpine glacier. None of the images that I photographed are alpine glaciers. They're all glaciers that end in water. But we used alpine glaciers because they're easier to measure. And I was really surprised that people were amazed that there were over 2,000 alpine glaciers that were retreating and only a little over 100 that were building. I found it, I was surprised actually that it was that huge a difference. I knew that there would be a difference, but still that was probably the biggest surprise for me and the people, I guess, that were looking at the exhibition. Mm-hmm. And I think that people have seen a lot of photographs of ice now. It's kind of become a thing, especially since 2011. I mean, that's, 13 years. Whereas I still think there are not that many people photographing, certainly the Louisiana wetlands. And when I started talking about wetlands 20 some odd years ago, I was having to say to people that weren't from this part of the country, we're losing a football field of wetlands every 52 minutes or whatever it is. It's kind of generally around there. And what they, in their minds, were thinking was, oh, Walmart has filled in this wetland, and so that's the loss of the wetlands. And I'd have to say, no, it's not wetlands that are being filled in by earth and no longer wetlands. They're wetlands that are going underwater and no longer wetlands. They're becoming open water. And that was a completely new concept 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And I think that was something that it took people a long time to come around to that if you're outside of Louisiana, if you're in the rest of the country. Because at that point, I was writing about toxins and air quality for a national organization. And when I had to talk about Louisiana, I had to explain about wetlands.
Yes, because we're so used to hearing about the wetlands, but it is kind of like a foreign concept to other people who don't live in this type of coastal environment. What do you think are some more of the similarities between the wetlands in Louisiana and the ice in the Arctic? Obviously, they're completely different, but when you pair them together, what were you struck by in terms of their similarities?
Well, this isn't really something that comes up in the photographs at all, because I haven't been to Alaska. Most of the towns or settlements in Greenland are on rock, so they don't have the subsidence problem that Alaska has when a place is built on permafrost. But that's an incredibly similar problem, that the Inuit communities that are on the coastline in Alaska are disappearing or having extraordinary difficulty because they're melting. Their ice is melting, and so they're losing the structure of what their houses are built on. And exactly the same thing is happening with the Homa and the Chitimacha and the communities that are in the wetlands of Louisiana. They're both having to move out of their environment because of climate issues and the inability of where they have traditionally lived being able to sustain them.
Right.
And sustain their environment, sustain their houses.
Yeah, that's interesting because we get so wrapped up in what we're dealing with here, but there's other places all around the world that are dealing with similar things, even if it looks like a different environment.
Right, yeah, and it's very, very similar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Have you always had kind of an environmental focus to your work, or did that kind of develop through doing Lamentations?
Well, I went to school in California, and I think that being aware of, there was a 7.1 earthquake that hit when I was there, and I had a boyfriend at the time who was kind of an anarchist, and he was saying, all of these fire stations and hospitals and police stations are on fault lines because that was kind of what was left when towns would build up and then, oh, this is where we can build. And this was way before fracking or anybody talked about fracking, even if it existed, I don't know. And he said, if you drill and pump water in these fault lines, So I guess it was being in California that really made me aware of the environment to begin with. And then coming back to Louisiana, when we would be out in the marshes, especially at South Pass, you could see the flares in the distance at night. And there was also the idea of the nutria and what they were doing to the environment, and how devastating that invasive species was to, I wasn't quite aware that they were eating the plants and undermining it in that way. I was just aware of how many there were.
Yeah. So it's just kind of through your own observation that you
Yes,
became interested in the environment. Yeah. What do you think is particularly powerful or unique about photography as a medium, especially when it comes to communicating these complex ideas about the environment and getting that message across to people?
I think probably the images that are the most powerful are the aerial photographs.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the wetlands are really hard to photograph, and that's part of the reason why they never have been photographed, or not never have been, but have been photographed not as much as something as beautiful as a mountain range, because we don't have that distance feature. And that's why it's so important when, to have clouds. There were certain times when I would just not go out because we'd get a day like today, which is, clear blue sky. That's pretty boring. And then also it's interesting because in the Arctic and the Antarctic, when you do have overcast, there's a lot of detail in the overcast. Whereas here, when you have overcast, it's just kind of flat, and you don't have any. Whereas the day that I went down to Grand Isle, which was Thursday, 2 weeks ago, oh my gosh, the clouds were beautiful. It was really, and so that's something that one has to watch and makes it that much more difficult. You can't count on the right day to go out.
Yeah, there's something about seeing it from an aerial view that you just can't comprehend and without that view, seeing the wetlands disappearing and seeing how close we are to the coast. I think a lot of people we talk to, this comes up a lot. People say, like, you don't realize how close you are to the river or to the coast. You know, you're just living your life, but it's right there.
And how much water we have around us. I mean, people that are coming into New Orleans for the first time on an airplane go,
Yeah.
you're completely surrounded by water. And we go,
Yeah.
we are.
Even driving in.
completely.
Yeah.
Driving in, anything. And then there are the dead trees, too, that show you the effect of saltwater intrusion on the land and how the trees have been affected. But the land is disappearing, and it's disappearing at, people say, well, what do you think the future of New Orleans is? I think before we completely disappear, we're going to be kind of like Venice. We're going to be, or actually Venice is in worse shape because they literally have water lapping on their doors. But we're going to be at the end of a causeway. We're going to be an island at the end of the causeway because of our walls.
Yeah.
And I think the psychology of walls is something I really want to think about. It's something I've started with the idea of, in the Middle Ages, people had walls, and what was the psychology of that? And here we have these walls, and how aware are we of our walls? I think that that's something that fascinates me.
That is really interesting. Thank you so much for talking to me today,
Well,
Tina.
thank you. It's been enjoyable.
Thank you for listening to On Our Watch. We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Tina Freeman. Don't forget to subscribe to On Our Watch on your favorite podcast app to be notified about future episodes. You can find our feature-length documentary On Our Watch, as well as a video version of today's episode, in the links below. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back with another episode next week. This podcast is made possible through support from the Greater New Orleans Foundation and executive produced by Bruno UK Steiner.